I'm Major Rebecca Wilson, 32, and I built a career that led me all the way to the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes. For years, I bent over backwards trying to earn my father's respect, grades, discipline, achievements. But when I joined the military, he laughed in front of our entire family and said, "She'll never matter." That was the moment I stopped chasing his approval and chose a different path. Have you ever been dismissed or belittled by someone you gave everything to? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being written off, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, respect, and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. 10 years into my military career, I received the kind of news that changes everything. I was sitting in my office, reviewing quarterly reports, when my commanding officer called me in for what I assumed would be a routine meeting. "Rebecca, I need to share something with you," Colonel Riviera said, gesturing for me to take a seat. "It's good news, but it's also going to be a significant adjustment." She handed me a formal letter bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. I read it twice before the words fully registered. I'd been selected for the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes. My portrait would hang alongside the most distinguished service members in American military history. The ceremony would take place in 6 weeks, with senior leadership from all branches attending. "This is unprecedented for someone at your level," Colonel Riviera explained. "The selection committee was impressed by your operational record, your leadership during the humanitarian crisis last year, and your contributions to strategic planning initiatives." I stared at the letter, feeling something between elation and disbelief. The Hall of Heroes represented the pinnacle of military recognition. Officers spent entire careers hoping to be considered for such an honor. "There will be a formal ceremony," she continued. "You'll need to provide a list of guests you'd like to invite. Family, mentors, people who've been important to your development as an officer." That night, I sat in my apartment with the invitation list spread across my kitchen table. The obvious choices were easy: current and former colleagues who'd supported my career, mentors who'd guided my development, close friends from various assignments. But the blank line marked family gave me pause. I hadn't spoken to Dad in over 2 years. Our last contact had been a brief, awkward phone call when my grandmother passed away. He'd answered the phone when I called to express condolences, and we'd managed about 30 seconds of stilted conversation before he handed the phone to Mom. The rational part of me said to leave the family section blank. Why invite people who'd shown no interest in my career, who'd made it clear that my achievements didn't matter to them? But there was another part, smaller, quieter, but persistent, that wondered what it would be like to have them there. To finally have something so undeniably significant that even Dad would have to acknowledge its importance. I filled out the rest of the invitation list and left the family section empty. For 3 weeks, I threw myself into preparation for the ceremony. There would be media interviews, speeches to write, coordination with Pentagon protocol officers. The magnitude of the honor was starting to sink in as I learned more about previous recipients and what the selection meant for my career trajectory. Then Mom called. "Rebecca, honey, I heard through the grapevine that something big is happening with your work. Mrs. Patterson from high school mentioned she saw an article about you in the base newsletter online." I'd forgotten that my old guidance counselor followed military news, probably keeping track of former students who'd gone into service. "It's a recognition ceremony," I said carefully. "For work I did on a project last year." "That sounds wonderful. Are we invited?" The direct question caught me off guard. I'd been prepared for curiosity, maybe some fishing for details. But Mom's straightforward request forced me to confront the decision I'd been avoiding. "It's in Washington," I said. "Pretty formal. Long day. We don't mind traveling. Your father and I haven't been to DC in years." Your father and I. Like they were a package deal, like Dad's attendance was automatically assumed despite years of silence between us. "Mom, I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Why not?" "We're proud of you, Rebecca. We always have been." The words hit like a physical blow. Proud of me? Where had that pride been during the years of dismissive comments and deliberate distance? Where was it when Dad declared I'd never matter in front of our entire family? "I don't think Dad would be interested," I said. A long pause. "You might be surprised." He talks about you more than you know. He talks about me. He keeps track of things. Articles online, mentions in the local paper when the base does community events. He's proud, Rebecca. He just doesn't know how to fix what got broken between you two. I sat in my kitchen, holding the phone and trying to process this information. Dad had been following my career, reading articles about base activities. The man who'd barely acknowledged my existence for years had been quietly monitoring my progress. If he's so interested, he knows how to pick up a phone, I said. You know your father. He's stubborn, prideful. He thinks he said things that can't be taken back. He did say things that can't be taken back. Another pause. But maybe they don't have to define everything else. After we hung up, I stared at the blank family section of my invitation list. This ceremony represented the pinnacle of everything I'd worked toward. The validation I'd stopped seeking from home had finally arrived from the institution that mattered most in my professional life. Did I want to share that moment with people who'd dismissed my potential from the beginning? Or did I want to prove, once and for all, exactly how wrong they'd been? 3 days before the deadline for final guest lists, I made a decision that surprised even me. I wrote John Wilson in the family section, then sealed the invitation in an envelope addressed to my father. But I didn't include any explanation, any context about what the ceremony represented or why I decided to invite him after years of silence. The invitation simply said, Work event. Washington, D.C., October 15th. RSVP required. If he wanted to understand what he'd been invited to, he could do the research himself. If he wanted to attend, he could make the effort to respond. If he didn't, I'd know exactly where I stood once and for all. 2 weeks later, I got a text from Mom. Your father will be there. No additional details. No mention of whether he understood what the event was, whether he'd looked up the Hall of Heroes, whether he had any sense of the significance of what he'd been invited to witness. Just, your father will be there. I spent the remaining weeks preparing for the ceremony with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. Part of me was excited about the recognition, proud of what I'd accomplished, eager to share the moment with colleagues who understood its importance. But another part kept wondering what Dad would think when he arrived and realized what he was actually attending. Would he be impressed? Shocked? Would he finally understand how wrong his assessment had been? Or would he find some way to minimize it, to maintain his original judgment despite evidence to the contrary? The night before the ceremony, I lay awake thinking about the last conversation we'd had before I stopped trying to maintain contact. The way he'd laughed at my ambitions, dismissed my potential, predicted my failure. Tomorrow, he'd stand in the Pentagon's most prestigious hall and watch me receive one of the military's highest honors. Whatever happened after that, at least I'd know I'd proven him completely, undeniably wrong. The morning of the ceremony arrived gray and drizzling, typical October weather in Washington. I'd been up since 5, reviewing my speech one final time, pressing my dress uniform until every ribbon sat perfectly, every crease was razor sharp. The Pentagon's Hall of Heroes occupied a corridor that felt more like a cathedral than a military building. Portraits of distinguished service members lined the walls, each one representing decades of dedication and extraordinary achievement. In a few hours, my photograph would join that distinguished company. I arrived early for the final briefing with protocol officers. They walked me through the schedule, opening remarks by the Secretary of Defense, presentation of my portrait, my response speech, reception afterward. Everything precisely timed, every detail choreographed. Your guests will be escorted to the VIP viewing area, the protocol officer explained. We have 12 people confirmed on your list. 12 people. Colleagues, mentors, friends who'd supported my career over the years. And one father who hadn't spoken to me in years, who was about to discover exactly what he'd been invited to witness. There's been a change, I said. One of my guests may need additional escort. He's not familiar with Pentagon procedures. Of course. We'll make sure everyone is taken care of. An hour before the ceremony began, I was in a small preparation room when my phone buzzed. A text from Mom, we're here. Your father is very quiet. I could picture them in the Pentagon's main entrance, Dad probably wearing the same suit he'd worn to Tommy's graduation, looking around at the marble corridors and uniformed officers with the expression he got when he felt out of his element. Did he understand yet what he was here for? Had he researched the Hall of Heroes? Did he have any sense of the significance of what was about to happen? Another text arrived. He asked me 3 times if I was sure we had the right place. Despite everything, I almost smiled. Dad's confusion was probably genuine. He'd received an invitation to a work event from a daughter who'd barely communicated with him in years. Of course, he was questioning whether he belonged here. 15 minutes before the ceremony, a knock came at my door. Major Wilson? There's a gentleman here who says he's your father. He's asking to speak with you. My chest tightened. This wasn't part of the schedule. Guests were supposed to be seated in the viewing area, not requesting private meetings with the honorees. Send him in. Dad appeared in the doorway wearing his gray suit and the expression I remembered from childhood, slightly uncomfortable, trying to project confidence while clearly feeling uncertain about the situation. We looked at each other for a long moment. He seemed smaller than I remembered, grayer around the temples, less imposing than the figure who dominated my early memories. Hello, Rebecca. Dad. I wanted to. He stopped, looked around the small room with its official portraits and military protocol materials scattered across the desk. I wanted to talk to you before whatever this starts. What do you think this is? He was quiet for several seconds, studying my dress uniform with its rows of ribbons, the formal atmosphere of the building around us. I'm not entirely sure, he said finally. But I'm starting to realize it's bigger than I thought when I agreed to come. Why did you come? The question surprised both of us. I hadn't planned to ask it, but once the words were out, I realized I genuinely wanted to know. Because you invited me, he said simply. First time in years you've asked me to be anywhere. That's not why I stopped inviting you. I know. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. I know why you stopped. We stood there in silence, 10 years of unspoken hurt filling the space between us. I could hear activity in the corridor outside, guests being seated, final preparations being made. Rebecca, I need to tell you something before this starts, Dad said. I was wrong. About everything. About what I said at Tommy's party, about what I thought you could accomplish, about. He gestured vaguely around the room. About all of this. The words I'd waited years to hear, delivered 5 minutes before the most important ceremony of my career. I know, I said. Do you? Because I've been carrying this around for a long time, and I wasn't sure I'd get another chance to say it. A protocol officer appeared in the doorway. Major Wilson? It's time. Dad stepped aside to let me pass, then spoke quietly as I reached the door. Whatever this is, whatever's about to happen. I want you to know I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and walked toward the Hall of Heroes. The corridor was lined with senior officers, Pentagon officials, and invited guests. Camera crews positioned themselves for optimal angles. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. The Secretary of Defense stepped to the podium and began speaking about service, sacrifice, and the extraordinary achievements that earned recognition in this hall. I listened to him describe my operational record, my leadership during crisis situations, my contributions to strategic initiatives. When he said my name and gestured toward the unveiled portrait, I felt a surge of something I couldn't quite identify. Not vindication, exactly. Not triumph. Something quieter but more profound. I looked out at the assembled guests and found Dad in the VIP section. He was staring at my portrait with an expression I'd never seen before, shock, pride, something that looked almost like awe. For the first time in my adult life, I had his complete attention. When I stepped to the podium to deliver my remarks, I spoke about service, about the privilege of leading others, about the importance of institutions that recognize excellence regardless of background or family history. I didn't mention Dad directly. I didn't need to. Standing in that hall, surrounded by portraits of American heroes, speaking to an audience of military leaders and Pentagon officials, I realized I'd already said everything that needed to be said. Not with words, but with a life lived on my own terms. After the ceremony, Dad approached me during the reception. We stood together in front of my portrait, neither of us speaking for several minutes. "I never imagined," he said finally. "I know. When you were growing up, I thought I understood what success looked like. I thought I knew what mattered." I waited for him to continue. "I was wrong about a lot of things. But I was most wrong about you." It wasn't an apology exactly. It was something more honest, an admission that his entire framework for understanding achievement had been flawed from the beginning. "Thank you for coming," I said. "Thank you for inviting me. Even after everything." We shook hands, formal, but genuine. Two adults who'd finally found a way to see each other clearly. Walking out of the Pentagon that day, I realized I'd gotten everything I'd worked for. Not just the recognition, not just the career success, but something more fundamental. I'd proven to myself that respect isn't something you wait for someone else to give you. It's something you build, piece by piece, through work that matters and choices that reflect your values. Everything else is just audience. The signs were there long before I ever thought about the military. My dad had this way of looking right through me whenever I mentioned anything that mattered to me. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. Dismissal wrapped in a smile that never quite reached his eyes. I was 16 when I first brought up the service academies. We were having dinner, the whole family crowded around our kitchen table, and I'd been working up the courage for weeks. My guidance counselor had mentioned West Point during a meeting about college applications. The idea had taken root immediately, the discipline, the purpose, the chance to serve something bigger than myself. "I've been thinking about applying to West Point," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My grades are good enough, and I think I could handle the physical requirements." My dad set down his fork and looked at me like I'd just announced I wanted to become a circus performer. Then he laughed. Not a warm, encouraging laugh. The kind that makes your stomach drop. "West Point." He shook his head, still chuckling. "Honey, that's not for people like us." My mom shot him a look, but she didn't say anything. My two brothers kept eating, pretending they hadn't heard. That was always their strategy, stay out of it, let someone else deal with Dad's moods. "What do you mean, people like us?" I asked. He waved his hand dismissively. "You know what I mean. That's for legacy families, kids whose fathers were generals. Not for a plumber's daughter from Ohio." The conversation moved on to my brother Mike's baseball season and whether he'd make varsity. Dad's whole demeanor changed when he talked to Mike, leaning forward, asking detailed questions, actually listening to the answers. I finished eating in silence, that familiar weight settling in my chest. Later that night, I researched the service academies online until my eyes burned. I printed out application requirements, admission statistics, everything I could find. The numbers were daunting, but they weren't impossible. Kids from all kinds of backgrounds got accepted. Small-town kids, first-generation college students, people whose parents had never worn a uniform. I kept the printed pages in a folder under my mattress. The pattern continued through my junior and senior years. When I joined the debate team and started winning tournaments, Dad would nod absently when I told him about it, then immediately ask Mike about football practice. When I made honor roll 3 semesters in a row, he'd grunt acknowledgement and change the subject to my younger brother Tommy's baseball stats. It wasn't that he was cruel. He just had a limited amount of attention, and most of it went to my brothers. They were athletes, like he'd been. They were loud and confident, filling up rooms the way he did. I was quieter, more serious, someone who earned respect through consistency rather than charisma. During my senior year, I applied to 3 service academies and 2 regular universities. I didn't tell anyone in my family about the academy applications. The rejection letters came first, 2 thin envelopes that I opened alone in my bedroom. The 3rd letter was thicker. I got into the Naval Academy. I stared at the acceptance letter for a long time, reading it over and over to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Then I walked downstairs to where my parents were watching television. "I got accepted to the Naval Academy," I said. My mom looked up from her magazine. "What's that?" "It's one of the military schools I applied to. In Maryland. Full scholarship, plus they pay you a salary." Dad muted the TV and turned to face me. "You applied to military school?" 3 of them, actually. This was the only one that accepted me. He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face like he was trying to figure out if I was joking. When did you apply? Last fall. The application process takes months. And you didn't think to mention this to your parents? There was an edge to his voice now, the one that appeared when he felt like someone was going behind his back. I'd heard it plenty of times when he argued with contractors or dealt with difficult customers. I mentioned West Point at dinner last year. You laughed. My mom closed her magazine. Sweetie, this is a big decision. We should have been involved in the process. Why? The question came out sharper than I intended. You weren't involved when Mike chose his college. You didn't question his football scholarship. Dad stood up from his recliner. That's different. How is it different? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was flat, matter-of-fact. The military isn't for you, Rebecca. You're too soft. You've never been in a real fight in your life. The words hit like a physical blow. Too soft. Coming from someone who'd never seen me get up at 5 a.m. for track practice, never watched me work 2 jobs to save money for college, never noticed that I was the one who kept the family organized when Mom got overwhelmed. I can handle it, I said. He sat back down and unmuted the TV. We'll see. That was it. No congratulations, no questions about what the academy was like or when I'd leave. Just, we'll see, delivered like a verdict. Over the next few months, as I prepared for plebe summer, Dad's attitude shifted from dismissive to something approaching disappointment. Not in my choice, but in me for making it. He'd make comments about military people being all show, about officers who thought they were better than everyone else. When relatives asked about my plans, he'd say I was trying out the military, like it was a hobby I'd abandon after a few weeks. The night before I left for Annapolis, he knocked on my bedroom door. I was packing my single-allowed bag, trying to fit everything I'd need for the next 4 years into a space smaller than my backpack. You sure about this? He asked. I looked up from folding my clothes. Yes. It's not too late to change your mind. That state school offered you a scholarship too. I'm sure, Dad. He nodded slowly, then turned to leave. At the doorway, he paused. Just remember, if this doesn't work out, you can always come home. The way he said it, not if you decide to come home, but if this doesn't work out, told me everything I needed to know about his expectations. He was already planning for my failure, already composing the "I told you so" speech in his head. I finished packing in silence, then set my alarm for 4 a.m. Tomorrow would be the beginning of everything I'd worked for, everything I'd dreamed about since that first dinner conversation 2 years ago. As I turned off my bedroom light, I could hear Dad in the living room, watching late-night sports highlights. The sound of the TV drifted up through the floor, familiar, comfortable, unchanged. Soon I'd be gone, and life in this house would continue exactly as it always had. Except I wouldn't be there to see whether he even noticed the difference. The day I signed my final enlistment papers should have been straightforward. A formality, really. I'd already completed 4 years at the academy, already committed to 5 years of active duty service. But Dad turned it into something else entirely. I was home on leave, just a week before my first assignment. The whole extended family had gathered for Tommy's high school graduation party. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in months. The backyard was full of lawn chairs and card tables, the smell of burgers on the grill mixing with the sound of kids running through sprinklers. I was standing near the food table, talking to my cousin Lisa about her nursing program, when Dad's voice cut through the conversation. Loud enough that people turned to look. Well, there she is. Our little sailor. The way he said it made my stomach clench. Not proud, not even neutral. Mocking. Lisa smiled uncertainly. Rebecca's in the Navy now, right? That's so cool. Oh, it's something, Dad said, moving closer with a beer in his hand. For years of college, and she decides she wants to play soldier. Sailor, I corrected quietly. And it's not playing. He took a long drink from his beer, then looked around at the small crowd that had gathered. My mom was there, Uncle Rob and Aunt Janet, a few of my brother's friends. All watching this unfold like it was dinner theater. You know what I told everyone when she first signed up for this military thing? Dad continued, his voice getting louder. I said she'll never matter. Too soft for the real world, too stubborn to admit when she's wrong. The words hit like ice water. I felt my face flush, felt the familiar tightness in my throat that came before tears. But I was 22 now, not 16. I'd survived plebe summer, survived 4 years of military discipline and academic pressure. I wasn't going to cry in front of my family. "She'll never matter," he repeated, like he was savoring the phrase. Mark my words. The silence that followed was deafening. Lisa looked down at her plate. Uncle Rob cleared his throat and mumbled something about checking on the grill. My mom busied herself rearranging chips and dip containers that didn't need rearranging. No one corrected him. No one defended me. They just stood there, letting his words hang in the summer air like smoke. I set down my drink and walked inside. Not storming off, not making a scene. Just leaving because staying would have meant saying things I couldn't take back. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back wore dress whites with ribbons I'd earned, carried herself with the posture that had been drilled into her during 4 years of military training. She looked nothing like the uncertain teenager who'd asked about West Point at a family dinner. But in that moment, surrounded by familiar bathroom wallpaper and childhood photos, I felt exactly like that scared 16-year-old again. When I came back outside 20 minutes later, the party had moved on. People were laughing about something else, Dad was holding court near the grill, and the moment had passed like it never happened. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom for what I knew would be the last time, I made a decision. I wasn't going to keep subjecting myself to this. I wasn't going to keep hoping that someday he'd see me differently, that someday his reaction would be pride instead of mockery. I was done chasing his approval. The next morning, I left for my first duty station 3 days early. I told my mom I needed to get settled, that the Navy wanted me to report sooner. She hugged me goodbye and told me to call when I could. Dad was in the garage, working on his truck engine. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him lean over the open hood, tools scattered across the workbench like they'd been my whole life. "I'm leaving," I said. He looked up, grease on his hands and forearms. "Drive safe." "I will." We looked at each other for a few seconds. I thought about saying something else, maybe trying one more time to bridge whatever gap had always existed between us. But what was the point? He'd made his position clear enough. "See you around," I said. He nodded and went back to his engine. I drove away from that house with the windows down and the radio up, heading toward a life that was completely my own. No more family gatherings where I felt like an outsider. No more explanations about what I did for work, why I chose it, whether it was worth it. The highway stretched ahead, leading to a naval base in Virginia, where people would evaluate me based on my performance, not my last name or my father's expectations. Where earning respect meant doing the job well, not convincing anyone that I deserved a chance in the first place. For the first time in years, I felt light. The words "she'll never matter" followed me, though. They became a soundtrack of sorts, playing in the background during difficult training exercises, challenging assignments, moments when I questioned my own abilities. But instead of defeating me, they began to fuel me. Every time I proved myself to a commanding officer, every time I led a team successfully, every time I earned another ribbon or commendation, those words were there. Not as a weight holding me down, but as a reminder of what I was working against. I stopped calling home as frequently. Stopped sending photos of military ceremonies and awards. Stopped sharing the details of promotions and special assignments. Not out of anger, exactly, but out of self-preservation. Why keep offering pieces of my life to someone who'd already decided they weren't worth anything? The distance grew naturally, the way it does when two people stop making the effort to stay connected. Holidays became optional. Family events became scheduling conflicts. The military gave me a ready excuse: deployments, training rotations, duty assignments that kept me busy and far away. My mom would call sometimes, updating me on neighborhood gossip and family news. She'd ask about my job in vague terms, clearly not understanding what I did but trying to show interest. She never mentioned Dad's comment from the graduation party, and neither did I. But I remembered it. And I carried it with me into every challenge that came next, every moment when I had to prove myself all over again. Sometimes the best motivation comes from the worst places. The sting of Dad's words cut deeper because of how hard I'd tried to earn his respect growing up. I was the kid who never had to be asked twice to do chores, who brought home report cards full of A's, who followed rules even when nobody was watching. My earliest memories are of trying to get his attention the way my brothers did. When Mike started playing Little League, I begged to join too. But there was no girls' team in our small town, and Dad never pushed for me to play on the boys' team the way some other parents did. Instead, he'd take Mike to practice while I stayed home with Mom, helping fold laundry or prep dinner. "Girls don't need sports like boys do," he'd say when I complained. "You've got other talents." But he never seemed particularly interested in those other talents either. When I joined the school choir and made it into the select ensemble, he'd nod politely at dinner when I mentioned upcoming performances. When the choir won regional competitions, he'd say, "That's nice," and ask Mike about his batting average. When I started tutoring classmates in math and earning money for it, he'd comment that it was good I was learning to work, then launch into stories about the construction jobs he'd worked as a teenager. Everything I accomplished got filtered through this lens of mild approval, followed by immediate redirection to my brothers. It wasn't malicious. Dad wasn't trying to hurt me. He just had limited bandwidth for parental attention, and most of it went to the kids who reminded him of himself. Mike was loud, athletic, the kind of confident that comes from always being the biggest kid in the room. Tommy was funny, charming, someone who could talk his way out of trouble and make adults laugh while he did it. They filled up space naturally, demanded attention without even trying. I was different. Quieter, more serious, someone who earned recognition through consistency rather than flash. I got satisfaction from completing difficult projects, from being the person others could rely on. But those qualities didn't translate well at family gatherings or dinner conversations. The worst part was that I kept trying anyway. Even after it became clear that Dad's interest was limited, I couldn't stop hoping that the next achievement would be the one that finally impressed him. In high school, I joined the debate team and discovered I was good at it. Really good. I could research complex topics, construct logical arguments, think quickly under pressure. We started winning tournaments, and I earned individual speaking awards at nearly every competition. I'd come home with trophies and certificates, excited to share the news. Dad would look at whatever I'd won, say something like, "Good job," or "Keep it up," then immediately turn to Mike. "How'd baseball practice go today?" And Mike would launch into a detailed recap of every inning, every play, every comment the coach had made. Dad would lean forward, asking follow-up questions, his whole body language changing from polite attention to genuine engagement. I'd sit there holding my debate trophy, watching him light up for my brother in a way he never did for me. It wasn't that Dad disliked me. He'd brag to his friends sometimes about my grades, mention to coworkers that I was smart or responsible. But it felt like he was describing a useful piece of equipment rather than his daughter. When I started thinking seriously about the military, part of me wondered if that might finally be something that would impress him. Dad had grown up hearing stories about his own father's service in Korea, had always spoken respectfully about military people. Maybe this would be different. Maybe this would finally be the thing that made him proud. The service academy idea came from my guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson. She'd noticed my grades and leadership activities, suggested I look into schools that might offer full scholarships. "Have you considered the military academies?" she asked during a meeting about college applications. "Your academic record is strong enough, and they're always looking for well-rounded students." I'd never thought about the military before that conversation. But something about the idea appealed to me immediately. The structure, the purpose, the chance to serve something bigger than myself. And yes, if I'm being honest, the hope that maybe this would finally be something Dad respected. I researched everything I could find about West Point, Annapolis, the Air Force Academy. I read about the admission requirements, the academic programs, the career opportunities afterward. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that this was exactly what I wanted. But when I brought it up at dinner that night, Dad's reaction told me everything I needed to know about his expectations for me. The laugh, the dismissive comment about people like us, the immediate shift in attention to Mike's sports achievements. It should have discouraged me. Instead, it made me more determined. I applied to all 3 academies in secret, spending hours on essays and applications after everyone else had gone to bed. I arranged for teacher recommendations, took the required fitness tests, completed interview processes without mentioning any of it at home. When the acceptance letter came from Annapolis, I felt a surge of vindication that was almost overwhelming. I'd done it. I'd gotten into one of the most competitive schools in the country, earned a full scholarship to an institution that produced leaders and officers. But Dad's reaction when I told him was the same dismissive attitude I'd gotten my whole life, wrapped in new words. Too soft, he said, like he was stating a simple fact about the weather. Standing in our living room that night, holding the acceptance letter that represented years of hard work and careful planning, I realized something important. Nothing I achieved was ever going to change his fundamental assessment of who I was. The revelation should have been devastating. Instead, it was liberating. I was done trying to earn something that was never going to be offered freely. I was done measuring my worth by his reaction to my accomplishments. I was done hoping that the next achievement would be the one that finally made him see me clearly. From now on, I do things because they mattered to me, because they aligned with my values and goals. If Dad approved, fine. If he didn't, that was his choice. But I wasn't going to keep waiting for permission to matter. The months that followed my enlistment were marked by an absence that felt heavier than any argument would have been. Dad didn't call to check how training was going. He didn't ask Mom to pass along messages or request updates on my progress. When I called home, he'd say hello if he answered the phone, then immediately hand it off to someone else. The silence was deliberate and complete. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. I was busy with the demands of military life, learning new systems, adapting to the culture, proving myself to instructors and peers who didn't know or care about my family dynamics. But during quiet moments, usually late at night when homesickness crept in, I felt the weight of that silence. My brothers called occasionally. Mike would give me updates on his college baseball season. Tommy would complain about high school drama. They never mentioned Dad directly, but sometimes they'd reference family gatherings I wasn't invited to, conversations that happened without me. Dad's been working on the garage, Mike mentioned during one call. Converting part of it into a workshop. You should see all the tools he's collected. The casual way he said it, like I might just drop by sometime to check it out, made it clear that my absence had become so normalized that my brothers didn't even think about it anymore. Mom was different. She'd call regularly, ask careful questions about my job, my living situation, whether I was eating enough. But she never brought up Dad's behavior, never acknowledged that there was anything unusual about our lack of communication. How are things at home? I asked during one of these calls. Oh, same as always. Your father's busy with work. The boys are doing well. Does he ever ask about me? A long pause. He wants you to be happy, Rebecca. You know that. It wasn't an answer, and we both knew it. The holidays were the hardest part. Thanksgiving and Christmas had always been big events in our family, the house full of relatives, multiple generations crowded around tables, kids running between rooms while adults caught up on months of news. My first year away, I got assigned to duty on Christmas Day. It was actually a relief. I could tell everyone at home that I couldn't make it because of work obligations, avoid the awkwardness of showing up to a gathering where half the family would pretend nothing had happened while the other half walked on eggshells. But the second year, I had leave available. I could have gone home. I didn't. Instead, I spent the holidays with other service members whose families were too far away or too complicated to visit. We cooked dinner together in the base kitchen, watched football, exchanged small gifts. It felt more like family than most of the family gatherings I'd attended growing up. Mom called on Christmas morning. We missed you yesterday, she said. The house felt empty. I'm sure you had plenty of people there. It's not the same without all my children. I wanted to ask if Dad had noticed my absence, if anyone had mentioned my name, if the empty chair at the dinner table had prompted any conversation about why I wasn't there. But I already knew the answer. Maybe next year, I said, knowing I probably wouldn't mean it when next year came around. The distance became easier with time. Months would pass between phone calls home. I stopped sending cards on birthdays and anniversaries. When mom would ask about my job, I'd give general answers, "It's going well," or "I'm learning a lot," without sharing specific details about promotions or commendations. Why offer pieces of my life to people who'd already decided they weren't interested? I built a different kind of life instead. Military friendships that were based on shared experiences and mutual respect. Mentors who evaluated me on performance rather than family history. A career path that rewarded competence and dedication rather than charisma or family connections. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who took me seriously by default. The work was challenging in ways I'd never experienced. Long hours, high stakes, constant pressure to perform at levels that would have seemed impossible a few years earlier. But I thrived in that environment. The structure made sense to me. The meritocracy felt fair. The mission gave meaning to the sacrifice. I advanced faster than I'd expected. Earned commendations for projects that required the kind of quiet competence I'd always possessed but never been recognized for. Got selected for specialized training programs, leadership roles, assignments that came with increasing responsibility. None of it made it back home in family conversations. During my 3rd year of service, Tommy graduated from high school. I sent a congratulations card with a check inside, the kind of gesture that acknowledges an occasion without requiring personal involvement. Mike called me afterward. "Mom was hoping you'd come for the party." I couldn't get leave, I lied. Dad asked where you were. The comment caught me off guard. It was the first time anyone had mentioned Dad asking about me in years. "What did you tell him?" "That you're busy with work. That the military keeps you pretty tied up." I waited for more details, what Dad had said in response, whether he'd seemed disappointed or just curious. But Mike moved on to other topics, and I didn't push. That night, I sat in my apartment thinking about what it meant that Dad had asked about me. Was it genuine interest or just polite conversation? Was he starting to regret the silence, or was he simply making small talk at a family gathering? I realized it didn't matter. Even if Dad was having second thoughts about our estrangement, even if he was starting to miss having me around, I wasn't going to be the one to reach out. I'd spent too many years chasing his approval, too many conversations hoping for a different reaction. The person who had declared that I'd never matter in front of our entire extended family was welcome to make the first move toward reconciliation. Until then, I had a life to build and a career to focus on. And I was doing just fine without his permission. By my 5th year of service, I'd stopped thinking about Dad's approval as something I needed. The military had given me what I'd been searching for my entire childhood, recognition based purely on merit, respect earned through competence, and a clear understanding of what success looked like. I was promoted ahead of schedule twice, selected for leadership positions that typically went to officers with more seniority. My fitness reports consistently rated me in the top 5% of my peer group. I'd completed specialized training programs, led successful missions, earned commendations from commanding officers who barely knew my first name, much less my family background. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely valued for who I was rather than who I was supposed to be. The work itself had evolved beyond what I'd imagined when I first enlisted. I was no longer the uncertain young officer trying to prove herself worthy of the uniform. I was running complex operations, managing teams of experienced personnel, making decisions that affected real missions with real consequences. My apartment near the base reflected this new confidence. It was small but carefully arranged, filled with books on military strategy and leadership, photographs from deployments and training exercises, awards and certificates that marked professional milestones rather than family memories. I'd created a life that was entirely my own. The estrangement from home had become so normalized that I rarely thought about it anymore. Months would pass without contact beyond the occasional text from Mom or brief call from one of my brothers. I developed a circle of military friends who understood the demands of service life, who didn't ask complicated questions about why I never went home for holidays. When people talked about their families, I'd listen politely and change the subject. When someone asked about my background, I'd give the basics, small town in Ohio, working class family, without elaborating on current relationships or communication patterns. It was easier that way. Clean. But the anniversary of Dad's "she'll never matter" comment still caught me off guard each year. Not with sadness, exactly. More like the ache of an old injury that flares up during certain weather patterns. A reminder of something that had shaped me, even though I'd moved beyond its immediate impact. During my 6th year, I was selected for a special assignment that required extended travel and minimal contact with home. Months passed without checking in with anyone in Ohio. When I finally called Mom, she sounded genuinely relieved to hear from me. "I was starting to worry," she said. "It's been so long since we've talked. I've been busy with work. Special project. Can you tell me about it?" I gave her the same general description I'd been giving for years: demanding schedule, interesting challenges, good opportunities for advancement. She listened the way she always did, asking polite follow-up questions that showed she was trying to understand without really grasping the specifics. "Your father asks about you sometimes," she said near the end of the call. It was the second time someone had mentioned this in 3 years. I waited for more details, but Mom seemed to think the comment stood on its own. "Does he? He wonders how you're doing. Whether you're happy with your choices." The phrasing was careful, diplomatic. Classic Mom, trying to bridge a gap without taking sides or assigning blame. "You can tell him I'm doing well," I said. "Really well, actually. Maybe you could tell him yourself sometime." The suggestion hung in the air between us. I could picture Mom in the kitchen, probably wiping down counters while she talked, hoping that this conversation might be the beginning of some larger reconciliation. "Maybe," I said, knowing I didn't mean it. After we hung up, I sat in my office reviewing the reports I'd been working on before the call. Performance evaluations for the team I supervised, project summaries for senior leadership, recommendations for junior officers who were ready for increased responsibility. All of it evidence of a career that had exceeded every expectation I'd had when I first enlisted. I thought about what it would be like to share these details with Dad, to explain the scope of my responsibilities, the complexity of the problems I solved, the respect I'd earned from colleagues and superiors. Would he be impressed? Would he finally understand that his assessment had been wrong? Or would he find ways to minimize it, the way he'd minimized everything else I'd accomplished over the years? The question felt irrelevant now. I wasn't the same person who desperately wanted his approval at family gatherings. I wasn't the teenager who'd applied to service academies partly to prove she was worthy of respect. I was someone who'd built a successful career based on her own abilities and determination. Someone who'd earned recognition from people whose opinions actually mattered in the context of the work I cared about. Dad's validation had become as unnecessary as his criticism. Still, when I was selected for another promotion later that year, one that came with significant responsibility and recognition, I found myself composing a mental letter to him, describing what the advancement meant, what I'd accomplished to earn it, how wrong he'd been about my potential. I never wrote the actual letter. Never called home to share the news. Never even mentioned it to Mom during our infrequent conversations. But the mental exercise served its purpose. It reminded me how much I'd grown, how far I'd traveled from the uncertain young woman who'd once craved his approval. These days, I measured success by different metrics. The trust of my commanding officers. The respect of the people I led. The knowledge that I was contributing something meaningful to causes larger than myself. I'd found what I'd been looking for all along. It just hadn't come from the place I'd expected to find it. Some bridges aren't worth rebuilding. Some relationships aren't worth salvaging. Sometimes the best thing you can do is move forward and build something better on your own. And that was the day my father walked into the Pentagon and saw my face on the Hall of Heroes wall. I didn't need his words anymore. The silence said enough. What about you? Have you ever had someone tell you that you'd never matter and then you prove them wrong? Did you ever get the chance to show them, or did you move forward without looking back? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories about strength, respect, and finding your own path.